I'm Stan Christensen, and this is All Things Negotiation. I've spent my career working as a professional negotiator and have taught a class on negotiation at Stanford University for over 20 years. On this podcast, I interview the experts, people who have negotiated in all walks of life. Together, we'll learn from their stories, their successes, their failures, and what they've learned along the way. Today, I had a chance to talk with Charles Kupchan. Charles Kupchan is a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. He's also a professor at Georgetown University on international affairs. He's a practitioner. He spent time in both the Obama administration and the Clinton administration in senior roles there. Our conversation today was wide-ranging. We talked about the war in Ukraine. We talked about the war in Israel. We talked about relations with China, with Russia. I think you're going to find the conversation interesting. So, Charles, welcome to the podcast.
Very good to be with you, Stan.
You and I were together recently in New York at the Council on Foreign Relations meeting and kind of lamenting some of the things that are going on in the world. And you said to me something I remembered. You said, Stan, I think life is about to get a hell of a lot more difficult. Why do you say this? Why are things tough?
Well, they're tough, I think, for two different reasons. The fracturing of liberal democracies and the fracturing of global politics. We are witnessing here in the United States a country that is deeply polarized and divided, and that division seems pretty intractable. I think under the best of circumstances, it's going to be a generation or two before we see working Americans get back up on their feet and the revitalization of the political center that really anchored American politics for most of the 20th century into the 21st century. And then outside the United States, I think we're going through a period in which power is diffusing from north to south and from west to east. We are not yet in what I would call a multipolar world, but I do think that we are headed in that direction, a decentered world, a world of multiple poles of power contending over primacy, over the rules of the road, over reputation. And as a consequence of this double whammy, if you will, liberal democracies having a tough time making it through the day, faced with the prospect of navigating and anchoring a world in which power is diffusing, that's a pretty toxic brew.
Yeah, and traditionally the U.S., it seems like we either recoil or try to remake the world, and we kind of go back and forth. Your 2020 book on the history of isolationism, which I'd recommend, discusses this. From a negotiation perspective, it just seems like we need to learn to coexist with others in the world. The kind of lessons we learned from the bipolar world when it was us and Russia just don't apply. Would you agree with that?
Well, I think that the bipolar world that you reference was not a world where we weren't talking to the bad guys, right? There was a lot of contact. There were summits, there were conferences, and then especially after the introduction of digital technology, there was more contact across geopolitical lines. And in some ways, we don't see that anymore. We're now in a world in which high-level American officials don't talk to high-level Russian officials, despite the fact that we have a war going on in Europe that's the biggest war since World War II, and despite the fact that this war has the potential to escalate to World War III. Russians and Americans ought to be talking to each other. The same goes for the United States and China. Things now are a little bit better than they were, say, a year ago, but the level of dialogue that exists between the United States and China, by far the two world's leading powers, it's just far short of what it should be given the agenda, given the degree to which U.S. China dialogue and diplomacy is essential to taming climate change, to dealing with nuclear proliferation, to dealing with global health and taming pandemics. So I think we're living in a world right now where talking to the bad guy is hard to come by, doesn't happen much, and it's in part because of the perils of domestic politics when you reach out and you talk to the bad guy.
So you and I think, agree that we should be in dialogue with allies, with adversaries. It's gotten more complicated as the world is moving, as you mentioned, towards a multipolar world. Let's just talk about, how do you establish those dialogues? How do you establish trust? Benefits of dealing in an atmosphere of trust. What comes to mind there?
Well, the absence of dialogue is not new, right? We've gone through periods of history in which you have adversaries that have very little contact with each other. And usually it takes an act of generosity, if you will, an act of strategic restraint to break the ice. I wrote a book about 10 years ago called How Enemies Become Friends. And in that book, I looked at a lot of cases of longstanding adversaries who actually call it quits and not just de-escalate, but they become friends. And in all of the cases that I looked at, the ball gets rolling because one side sends a signal to the other side that they want to put animosity and rivalry behind them. In the case of the United States and the UK, for example, we were each other's worst enemies from the Revolutionary War through the end of the 19th century. And then toward the end of that period, a dispute breaks out between British Guiana and Venezuela over their border. And the United States, which has enjoyed decades of fast economic growth after the Civil War, is a little uppity at this point. And it sends a message to the British cabinet: this dispute between you and Venezuela is occurring in the Western Hemisphere. It's our backyard. The Monroe Doctrine applies. We hereby request that you submit this dispute to neutral arbitration. The British cabinet sends back a message that basically says, stick it. Don't tell us what to do. The U.S. then starts talking about war. And in fact, it raises the readiness of its growing fleet. And this message gets back to the British cabinet, and the British cabinet go, holy moly, we cannot afford to go to war with the United States. We got too many other fish to fry. We've got the Germans, the Japanese, the Boers in South Africa. The last thing we need is a war with the United States. They then send back a message to Washington that says, we hear you. We are sending this to neutral arbitration, and we hereby recognize the Monroe Doctrine. And American officials are like, what the heck's going on here? But it was that signal, that breakthrough, that act of generosity, if you will, that was the beginning of Anglo-American rapprochement.
It seems like, and I think you talk in your book about when someone makes a unilateral, we could call it a concession, it seems to beget the similar behavior on the other side. There are reciprocal concessions that come. You outline other criteria for breaking out a stable peace. You talk about societal integration. You talk about shared identities. Let's sort of fast forward to today's world. Now, the conflict in Ukraine is not us versus Russia. We're sort of a proxy there, or at least a contributor on the Ukrainian side. How does that apply in this situation? What would be the unilateral concession that could be made by Ukraine or Russia or us? Bring us up to speed.
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough one because we are in the middle of a war. It's a war of aggression, unambiguous. War crimes have been committed by the Russians. And so to kind of get to a point where you're beginning to see trust is, I think, at this point, unrealistic. That having been said, I do think that the opening move probably needs to come from the Russians. They're the aggressor. They're the superior power. And they need to send a signal to the Ukrainians and to the supporters of Ukraine that they're prepared to de-escalate and to ultimately move toward a ceasefire. And Putin has at times suggested as much, but he suggests as much in the context of a poison pill. In other words, the last time he talked about a ceasefire, he said, well, I'm ready for a ceasefire as long as you Ukrainians withdraw from all the 4 oblasts that I have declared part of Russia and recognize that these are part of Russia and say that you're not going to join NATO. And that's not how you play ball. That is not an opening gambit that is credible. If he had said, I'm willing to freeze in place, I'm willing tonight to tell my forces not to fire another shot, and then we can sit at the negotiating table and discuss where we go from here, he would have jammed the Ukrainians. That's an offer that I think many members of the international community might be willing to get behind. But it is that kind of more sincere, more credible readiness to say to the other side, okay, enough is enough. Let's move to a better place. That's how you kind of break the barrier. So far, the Russians have shown no readiness to do that.
As we look at that conflict, and you and Richard Haas wrote a piece, I think it was in the spring, and my memory of that is you suggested, continuing armaments, in fact, escalating. I think you might have even talked about giving them F-16s and training the pilots. And then you said, let's really push hard through the spring and summer, and then maybe we'll be in a better position because the stalemate will be more obvious. Any further thoughts? How have things evolved since the spring, and what would you recommend?
Well, one of the things, Stan, that I discovered in the book about how enemies become friends is not that opening move is key, but that opening move does not come from altruism. Why did the British cabinet send a message to the U.S. that said, okay, you're right, we like you, and we want to stop this long era of rivalry with you? They did it because they had their backs up against the wall, because there were high seas fleets being developed simultaneously in a number of powers, some of which were very close to the United Kingdom. And as a consequence, they said, we can't go to war with the United States. It's too dangerous. When Indonesia reached out to Malaysia and said, we want to call quits our confrontation with you, it wasn't out of the goodness of their hearts. It was because of international sanctions and their impact on the Indonesian economy. So bottom line here is that these breakthroughs, these acts of generosity occur when one side feels that it needs to go down that road. And so Richard Haas and I were saying, you give more arms to the Ukrainians, you make it clear to the Russians that they're not going to win, you make it clear to the Russians that they're not going to subjugate Ukraine. That then convinces them and gives them incentives to say, okay, maybe we should try diplomacy. And so you have to set the table. You need to get the incentive structure right for the parties to come together and talk about making peace. And ultimately, you look back at history, when do wars tend to move towards ceasefire and negotiations? Stalemate. What do we need to get that stalemate? To give Ukraine what it needs to block Russian aggression.
I guess I feel like we basically have a stalemate. There hasn't been that much movement of territory since the spring. There was all this talk of a big spring offensive. I think 88% of the territory roughly is still in Ukraine. And so Russia, if we locked in now, would take some territory. But it doesn't feel like there's much other than a stalemate. Do you see that differently?
Just for the record, the figure is closer to 80% than 88%. But
okay.
Bottom line is Ukraine is still in possession of the vast majority of its territory, the 91 borders. But, a fifth of your country is a big deal. And the people that are living under Russian occupation, that's a big deal. But I broadly agree with you. We have not seen any major advances since the Ukrainians took back about half of what Russia had occupied in 2022. Since then, there is a relatively static front line. The Ukrainians made a little bit of progress in their 2023 offensive. When that stalled, the Russians were able to make some progress in Kharkiv in the north. They've pushed a little bit further west in Donbass. But in general, neither side really has generated the combat capability to deal a decisive blow to the other. And it's because we are more or less at a stalemate that I think we are getting close to diplomacy. And really, I think in some ways the question is, when will the politics be ripe? When will Zelensky be able and willing to talk to the Russians and to discuss with the U.S. president, the German chancellor, the French president, a negotiating strategy? We're not there yet. I don't think we're far away from that point.
What would your advice be if they called you and they said, Charles, and this is sort of a combination of, Western Europe, the Western Alliance essentially, and said, what should we do to push for negotiation? Is that initially a conversation with Zelensky? Is it putting some pressure on him? How would you do it?
First thing I would do is I would have two parallel conversations. One between Washington and Kyiv. Today, that means between Biden and Zelensky, in which Biden simply has some very straightforward and honest conversations with the Ukrainian president in which he says, listen, front line hasn't moved very much. You're still in possession of most of your country. Russia has already been dealt a severe strategic defeat. Let's not let the perfect become the enemy of the good. And the good is turning the 81% of Ukraine that's still Ukraine into a success story and deferring to a later date the disposition of those territories under Russian occupation. And then I would put the phone down and I'd pick it up and I'd call European allies. Probably the NATO Secretary General, the head of France, the head of Germany, the head of the UK, maybe the Polish Prime Minister, and have the same conversation and try to forge a meeting of the minds that could then end up in a face-to-face meeting of those players with Zelensky in which you map out a negotiating strategy. And once you have that, then you hit go and you begin to reach out to Russia and you broaden the circle so that this turns into a Russian, Ukrainian, American, European conversation, which you may want to pull the Chinese into. In part because...
I was going to ask you about... I was going to ask you about the Chinese because it feels like they're the only ones that have much sway over Putin. We certainly don't. What would you like the Chinese to do?
That's precisely, Stan, why I would pull them in. Because if there's anybody who can say to Vladimir Putin, it's enough, it's Xi Jinping. And that's simply because this is a war that has pushed Russia into the arms of China. And, if Xi Jinping were to say to Putin, you need to stop. You need to stop killing Ukrainians, he would hear them. And so at the right time, there is a play here that goes through Beijing to Moscow. We're not there yet, but it's yet another reason that I think the U.S. ought to invest in a better diplomatic relationship with China, because we're going to need them when it comes to ending the war in Ukraine, and we're going to need them when it comes to advancing the peace process in the Middle East. Why? Because China has more leverage than Iran, than anybody else. Iran is the puppet master behind the war in Gaza, if we're going to wrestle this horrific war to the ground, it's going to require somebody leaning on the Iranians.
So if I could summarize your thoughts, you're saying negotiations sooner than later. We're not there yet, but sooner than later. Probably doesn't make sense for Ukraine to dig in on the 2022 boundaries, probably unrealistic. And we should pull China in and show them that we have common interest in getting that conflict finished, assuming Putin will listen to China. I think you're optimistic there. It doesn't seem like they've had very much influence so far. Maybe they haven't tried to influence, but, she made that call, somewhat famously to Zelensky. Nothing happened there. I guess what makes you feel optimistic that the Chinese could get Russia to stand down?
Two comments. One, my position would not be to say to Zelensky, kiss goodbye, Crimea and Donbass. It would be, Mr. Zelensky, play the long game. Turn what you control into a prosperous, defensible, stable democracy. And we will then work with you over the long run to get back to your 91 borders. Just like we did with the Baltics, right? The Baltics were ostensibly part of the Soviet Union. We never recognized them as part of the Soviet Union. Where are they now? Well, they're independent democracies and members of NATO. So, am I optimistic that Crimea will again be part of Ukraine? No. Do I think it could happen after Putin is dead and you have a new democratic regime in Russia if that happens? Yes. The second comment, I don't disagree with you, Stan, about China. And I don't think the problem is that Xi Jinping doesn't have enough leverage over Putin. I think that Xi Jinping may not want to play that card. And I don't think that the Chinese love this war. And that's because it creates a level of geopolitical and geoeconomic stability that does not play to the advantages of China. On the other hand, this is a war that is keeping the United States anchored in Europe. The U.S. is focused on countering Russia, not on countering China. And so it may take some serious convincing to get Xi to lean on Putin. My point would be when he gets to that point, when he's ready to do that, I think he will, in fact, have the necessary leverage.
I like that take. I guess I worry that Putin is in the take territory business. It's in his DNA. I worry, I worked a lot in the early 90s in Abkhazia and Georgia, South Ossetia on those conflicts. And if I were a Georgian, if I were a Moldovan, I'd be nervous about Putin. So I see this as a pause for Putin rather than, redefining boundaries to whether it's 2022 or 1991. Thoughts about that?
Complete agreement. Although, let me add one further comment. A lot of my dialogue with others in the United States and Europe about Ukraine, they say to me when I say, let's negotiate, oh, no, you can't do that. And if Putin is not defeated and driven from Donbass, he's just going to do this again, right? I'm in the same place you are. Putin is going to do this again, no matter how and where the conflict in Ukraine ends. And that's because that's Putin. That's what he does. That's his game. In fact, he doesn't really have another game because he hasn't turned Russia into a 21st century economy with a knowledge-based, digitalized economy like many other major powers. And so what does he have to play? Eurasian nationalism, grabbing chunks of territory from his neighbors, beating his chest and saying, I'm defending ethnic Russians and I'm defending greater Russia. So he will do this again. We just don't know where or when, but I don't think it depends upon defeating him in Ukraine. I think it's just that's going to be the case as long as he's in power. And that's why I think what President Biden has been doing over the last 6 to 8 months is the right thing, which is get a glide path for aid to Ukraine at least for a decade. Because no matter how this ends, Putin may try again to topple the government. And as a consequence, we need to make sure Ukraine has what it needs to defend itself for the long haul.
Yeah, we are in agreement about that. I'm very worried about and again, you're an expert on this, on the isolationist tendencies, the kind of America First wing of the Republican Party, which, gosh, in the last few months, I wonder if it's a wing or just actually the new party platform. Let's turn to China a bit, since they are the other major world power and will be for our lifetime, certainly. It's always felt to me like our biggest asset is our allies. You know, if we continue to be aligned with Australia and Japan and Western Europe and Indonesia, hopefully India, we compete well with China. But if we pull back from those alliances, China is going to have a larger economy. China is going to have a larger military. Would you coincide with that? Thoughts about that and that emphasis?
Yeah, I mean, I agree and I disagree. I agree that one of our greatest assets is our alliances, and that our ability to build networks of allies in Asia, in the Middle East, in Europe is unique. And it's in many respects an asset that the Chinese completely lack. They don't really have allies. They don't like allies. In many respects, they're similar to the United States when it was arriving on the scene as a great power. We didn't like alliances. We wanted nothing to do with defense commitments. And then we discovered them after World War II. So it's kind of new for the United States. But, and yeah, it is a major point of leverage. Where I would disagree with you is that we can't bet on our alliances and the aggregation of our power alongside our allies to arrest the world from moving ahead. That is to say, China is going to grow. China will have the world's largest economy probably in a decade. It will translate that economic power into military power. And we're just going to have to get used to living in a world where there is a peer competitor of the United States. That's not going to be easy, right? We are used to calling the shots. We are used to having unchallenged dominance. In the Cold War, U.S. plus its allies amounted to about 80 to 85% of global GDP. The Soviet Union topped out at roughly 50% of U.S. GDP. That world is not sustainable, right? If you look at where will we be by the second half of this century? Top economy in the world, China. Number 2, India. Number 3, the United States. Number 4, Indonesia. What about our European allies? All told, by the end of this century, around 10% of global GDP. And that's why I said earlier, power shifting from west to east and north to south, that's not stoppable. What we need to do is figure out how to get there peacefully.
And if we go back to your book that we talked about before, How Enemies Become Friends, you talk about, your framework includes social integration, cultural integration. That's tougher with Asia for us. So what are the things that we could do using your framework? Are there unilateral concessions we should be making to China to build that relationship? Because I agree with you, we need to have better relationship with China. This idea that because they're not a democracy, they're our enemy, I think is short-sighted. We need them for things like what's going on in Russia. We need them for things like what's going on in Iran. And so how does that framework apply to China, and what should we be doing differently?
Yeah, I mean, we should not be complacent. China behaves in ways that make clear that they pose a threat to the United States and to the democratic way of life, whether it's what they're doing to Hong Kong or what they're doing to Uyghurs or their expansionist tendencies in the South China and East China Sea, or their use of cyber tools or their coercive leverage that they're building in the global south through their Belt and Road Initiative. I don't want to sound like someone who doesn't think we got a problem out there. We do. That having been said, I don't think we should inflate the problem. And I do think that we tend to do that in part for reasons of domestic politics. It's very hard to get Democrats and Republicans to agree on anything these days. The one thing that you can find some agreement on is stand up to China, be tough with China. So if I were to kind of sketch out a way of moving the ball in a better direction, I would probably say, let's start with the lower hanging fruit. Let's start with the situation in the Middle East. Why aren't Chinese warships part of the coalition to go after the Houthi? They should be, because they're the ones that are suffering most from the interruption of trade. I think we might be able to get the Chinese, if we had a somewhat better relationship with them, to do more to rein in Iran. You and I have already spoken in this chat about their potential role in Ukraine. Back in the day, the United States and China cooperated on health issues, opened a joint clinic in Africa. So I would say let's not try to tackle the big issues in Asia Pacific. Let's start by finding places where U.S. and Chinese interests overlap and begin to build a minimum level of dialogue and cooperation in those areas. Once you've done that, I think you then have the basis for tackling some of the tougher issues, Taiwan, North Korea. And by tackling, I don't mean resolving, because I don't think we're going to resolve them anytime soon, but compartmentalizing them, kicking the can down the road.
I've done a fair amount of work in China, mostly in the business side, and people that, I have friends that have lived in Beijing for 10 years, and they say it's impossible to culturally assimilate with the Chinese. They're just closed to it. So how big a hurdle is that it's difficult to assimilate, it's difficult to have cultural exchange, our identities are completely different. It's easy if we go back to Europe to see, your example of we're enemies with the British for 100 years, but then we're able to assimilate and have cultural exchange. But that was based on similar language, a lot of similar values. Feels like that's hard for me with China. Any thoughts on that?
I think you hit the nail on the head. Identity is socially constructed and it's malleable, right? So that the French and the Germans used to hate each other and be each other's main other. And now you drive across the border from France to Germany and you might see a sheep, but you don't see a tank and you don't see a border guard and you don't see a money changer, right? That's revolutionary. That's magical. That happens. But there was a sort of common sense of Europeanhood. There was a common Christian tradition. Interestingly, to go back to the Anglo-American example, once that ball got rolling and the U.S. and the U.K. started to trade concessions, then it sort of osmosed into the broader public. And Americans and Brits started to talk about each other as members of the same family. And the President of the United States, the Prime Minister of Britain, started to talk about Anglo-American war as a civil war, as fratricide. At that very same time, the British were also engaging in a process of rapprochement with Japan, because they wanted to pull the same kind of maneuver in the East that they were pulling with the United States, which has allowed them to pull their fleet out. So they formed an alliance with the Japanese in the early 1900s. And Parliament went ape. What many parliamentarians said, this is the beginning of the end of the British Empire because we have just formed an alliance with a yellow race. And what does that say? That says that it's more difficult to really form close partnerships that don't enjoy this kind of sense of cultural commonality. Today, U.S. and Japan are doing pretty well. which suggests that maybe we can do it with the Chinese, but it ain't going to be easy. There are deep geopolitical differences, and beneath the surface, as you put it, Stan, deep cultural differences. The Chinese are very ethnocentric people. They have very few immigrants. And as a consequence, just the final comment on this, the flip side of that is positive, which is that, the United States wants to go out and change the world. The United States believes that behind every Iraqi is a wannabe American, which is why everyone said, oh, we're going to arrive in Baghdad and they're going to meet us with roses in the streets. The Chinese don't want to do that. They don't believe that behind every Iraqi is a wannabe Confucian. And as a consequence, I don't think they're out there to change the world. That may make China more ready to live in a world of ideological diversity than the United States.
I hope so. And I agree that on our side, we're the ones that are more likely to need the adjustment, to just recognize that. People don't have to live under democracies. People don't have to have our same values for us to coexist and get along. The whole art of negotiation is learning to get along with people who are different from you, as opposed to try to assimilate down to homogeneity. So I think you and I agree on that. Let's make a hard turn to Israel. It's one of the major conflicts in the world now. And I think the Biden administration has largely been unsuccessful at being persuasive with Israel. Obviously, there's a lot of politics involved. I think Biden said to Netanyahu, look, don't make the same mistakes that we made in 9/11 by overreacting. From my perspective, Netanyahu's essentially ignored him. I question how much influence we have over there. Your thoughts on Israel?
I think Biden was 100% right when he said, don't make the same mistakes we did. Unfortunately, the Israelis didn't listen to him, and they have used military force to achieve political outcomes which are not particularly susceptible to being shaped by military force. They, like we did in Iraq, took down the existing political infrastructure, and rather than planning for what comes the day after, they're standing around in the rubble. Even as we speak, months after October 7, there is no plan, as far as I know, for who's going to govern Gaza and who's going to rebuild Gaza and who's going to provide security. And that's, that is not good. So, I'm someone who believes that Israel has every right to defend itself. I believe that Israel cannot live next door to a Gaza Strip bristling with an armed Hamas group. But that doesn't mean that you go in and you basically take down the Gaza Strip, destroy much of it, and leave 2+ million Palestinians living in dire straits. I do think that we're probably getting somewhere close to an end game. And I think that end game will be arrived at in part because a lot of Hamas has been militarily dismantled, and in part because I think that the pressure is growing on Netanyahu to get a ceasefire, get the hostages out, and move on. But the damage will be done. And it's going to be very hard to pick up the pieces. If there is a silver lining here, it would be that the reaction against this war and against the far-right government led by Bibi Netanyahu will resuscitate Israel's political center. That political center will ultimately move forward with the normalization of relationship with Saudi Arabia. And that there could be ultimately a vision of a two-state solution, of Israel's normalization of its relationships with its neighbors, and a boxing in of Iran. Right now, that is a dim light at the end of the tunnel, but it's not out of the question.
Yeah, I'm more pessimistic than you. I think dim is generous. I worry more about the North than I do about Gaza, and the regional escalation. It still feels to me like, from a diplomacy perspective, we have not applied enough heat to Israel. Obviously, some of that is, well, maybe most of it is politics, but the dangers that Iran poses, I hope you're right that China could get interested in working with us to calm things down on the Iranian front. But I'm pessimistic. I think there's a 50-50 chance we end up with a expanded military effort in the north of Israel, which I think it just would be a disaster for all the parties.
I'd probably put the likelihood at above 50-50. And I think one of the reasons that Netanyahu's trying to wind things down in the south is because he wants to focus on the north. And he's under a lot of pressure. I mean, there are a lot of Israelis that live in the north, in Metula, in Kiryat Shimona, in various kinds of kibbutzim on the border with Lebanon. They're empty. Right? I was in Israel in January in a Sheraton hotel, 90% of which was occupied by Israeli families that had been evacuated from their homes. You can't live that way forever. He needs to be able to get people back home, and that I'm guessing in their mind is going to require a military operation in southern Lebanon. But you open that Pandora's box, who knows where it goes? And so I guess I share your pessimism, but I'm trying to offer you and your listeners a little grain of optimism.
Okay, I think I'm a little more pessimistic than you in general, and I love your optimism. Let's talk about the current political situation in the last few minutes in the U.S. There is a 50-50 chance that we end up with a Trump presidency. I feel like the isolationism really is going to be the driver of foreign policy under a Trump administration. As an internationalist that has spent a lot of time working on international conflict, that saddens me and I worry for it. I think it hurts us economically. I think it hurts us with our allies. How big a problem is a Trump presidency from a foreign policy perspective if it happens?
Well, I think, one of my takeaways from the Trump era, the Biden era, and the book you mentioned on isolationism is that it is in our DNA. It is in the American experience. And I think Democrats dismiss the pull of an America First narrative at their peril, right? It is out there. And to be blunt, I get it, right? I mean, if you're making $14 an hour, $13 an hour in an Amazon warehouse or at Walmart, and you've got 3 kids and you're having trouble putting food on the table, you're kind of scratching your head and saying, $61 billion for Ukraine when the war isn't going very well? What's going on here? And so I do think that this is a real debate. It has real deep roots in American history. And I completely agree with you that the United States cannot afford to detach itself from the world. There's no such thing as detachment or insulation in the 21st century. That having been said, we need a brand of foreign policy that Americans buy into and support. And so for me, there's a middle road. We spent most of our history doing too little and running away from the world. Then starting with Pearl Harbor, we tried to run the world and ended up biting off too much, right? Turning Afghanistan and Iraq into Ohio. That didn't go so well, Stan. And it's partly why Trump was elected, right? Because Americans were sort of looking at this story and saying, what are these people in Washington doing? So they're asking serious questions. And so to me, the challenge is we need to find the sweet spot. We need to ensure that the United States stays the world's leader, the leader of the free world, But we also need to find a middle ground around which we can build the support of the American electorate. I think it's doable. I think the next administration may do it. And I'm kind of optimistic. You and I are speaking just after President Biden has said that he is not going to run. I'm mightily relieved because I think that his candidacy was a problem. I think the Democrats are going to hit the ground running. We don't know exactly what the ticket is going to look like. By choosing Vance as his running mate, Trump has doubled down on his voter base on the far right. That gives the Democrats a wide berth to reach out to the political center, to moderate Republicans, to independents, to women in suburban America, in swing states. And so I'm not pessimistic about the outcome of this election. I think the Democrats have a fighting chance and may well pull it off.
Hope you're right there. I guess, to me, we need to do a better job, we collectively, on educating people about the importance of having a foreign policy. I think that there are tremendous, if only for self-interest, the idea that we could pull back from our relationships in trade or politics, I think makes the economy worse, and the economy speaks to everybody. And so I think an effective foreign policy could be communicated to the average Trump voter as an economic necessity, as opposed to just the overly simplistic buy American.
I completely agree with you, but it means reforming the hyper brand of globalization that we pursued in the 1990s. Because that brand of globalization handsomely rewarded lots of corporations and lots of Americans in the top 1%. But it disadvantaged many working Americans, right? They felt left behind by globalization. And in many respects, they were. Automation was a bigger problem driving in deindustrialization than free trade, but they combined together to make life difficult in many parts of the American heartland. So I think if we pursue a policy of targeted investment in the heartland, we show Americans why trade is good, not just for Google and Microsoft and Boeing, but for all of you who are working out there in Ohio and Kansas and Michigan. Yeah, we can rebuild it. And that, I think Biden started off, though, he started off, I want to pursue a foreign policy for the middle class. I think he got distracted by the war in Ukraine, but I think he got it. Now he's not going to run for re-election, and I think that's probably the right decision. But he did start the process of reforming foreign policy to win back the support of average working Americans. And that's, I think, where we need to begin.
We agree about that. And I think that's a great place to stop. Charles, thank you so much for your time. As always, super enlightening. And just appreciate you taking the time with us
today. Really
enjoyed
the conversation, Stan, and hope we have a chance to do it again.
Thanks for listening to All Things Negotiation. You can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. If you enjoyed the show, please consider giving us a rating and leaving a review, which helps others find the show. The show was produced by Benny Beausoleil. Original music by Peter Breinhold. Designed by Aubrey Benson. Thanks for listening.